In this video, we are going to use row operations to find the inverse of this matrix. Now, whenever we're going to do this process, our first step is going to be to augment our initial matrix with the identity matrix. So let's just get rid of this. And I'm going to augment with the identity matrix 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1. We're going to use the 3 by 3 to augment because that's how many rows we have in our original matrix. Now we're going to use row operations. And remember, we have 3 types of row operations that we can use. We can switch rows. We can multiply a row by a non-zero number. And we can add or subtract rows. So these are our legal row operations. So looking at our matrix that we're starting with, my first goal is to change this term to a 1, and then I'm going to want to make these 2 cells, turn those into zeros. So one thing that I can do to make that first cell turn into a 1 is we could just switch rows 1 and 2. And by doing that, I get a 1 in the first cell of that column, and then I get a 0 in the second cell. So I'm going to switch row 1 and row 2. So that means that row 1 is going to become 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 0. And then row 2, 0, 1, 2, 1, 0, 0. And then row 3, at this point, we're not changing. So now I'm looking at the last cell here in the first column. It's a 3. We need to turn that into a 0. The way to do that is going to be taking row 3, and we're going to subtract from row 3 3 times row 1. If I multiply row 1 by 3, then that first term becomes a 3, and then when I subtract it from the 3, then we get 0. Now, just to make sure that we're careful about the math and we don't make too many mistakes here, I'm going to write this down over here, row 3 minus 3 times row 1. I'm going to go ahead and list out row 3, 3, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1. And then we're going to subtract. And we're going to do 3 times row 1. So I'm going to set all this up, and let's put in the cells from row 1. Times 1, times 2, times 3, times 0, times 1, times 0. This just keeps our work kind of organized and a little bit more methodical so that we have a less chance of making mistakes as we go through and do all this arithmetic. So 3 times 1 is 0, and 3 minus 0 is 3. 3 times 2 is 6, and 1 minus 6 is negative 5. I'm sorry, see, I already made a mistake. Let's go back. 3 times 1 is 3, and 3 minus 3 is 0. Look at that. 3 times 2 is 6, and 1 minus 6 is negative 5. 3 times 3 is 9, 1 minus 9, negative 8. 3 times 0 is 0, and 0 minus 0 is 0. 3 times 1 is 3, 0 minus 3 is negative 3, and 3 times 0 is 0, 1 minus 0 is 1. So for our new row 3, we're going to write in 0, negative 5, negative 8, 0, negative 3, and 1. And then our first 2 rows are still the same. So now if we look at our first column, we have 1, 0, 0 in that column. And so that column is good. We are ready to move on to column number 2. Now the first thing we wanted to do in column number 2 is turn that center cell into a 1. Well, it already is a 1. So we need to look at the 2 and the negative 5. Both of those cells need to become zeros. So let's think about how we can do that, turn that 2 into a 0. Remember that to get a 0, we always want to subtract. And so the best way to turn this into a 0 is that we're going to multiply row 2 times negative 2, so that this 1 will become a negative 2, and then we're going to add that to row 1. So I'm going to write this actually as row 1 minus 2 times row 2. Now we're going to do our work over here again to the side. Keep it organized. Row 1 minus 2 times row 2, so row 1, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 0. And I'm going to subtract. We're going to multiply all of these numbers in row 2 by 2. And here's row 2 times 0 times 1 times 2 times 1 times 0 times 0. Okay, so 2 times 0 is 0, and 1 minus 0 is 1. 2 times 1 is 2, and 2 minus 2 is 0. There's the 0 that we were trying to get. 2 times 2 is 4. 3 minus 4 is negative 1. 2 times 1 is 2. 0 minus 2, negative 2. 2 times 0 is 0, and 1 minus 0 is 1. And then 2 times 0 is 0, and 0 minus 0 is 0. So the new row 1 is 1, 0, negative 1, negative 2, 1, and 0. And our other two rows are still the same. Okay, so now we are, at this point in our matrix, we're looking at that negative 5 in the bottom cell of the second column. We want that to become 0. And so in order to make that happen, we are going to add row 3 to 5 times row 2. If I multiply row 2 times 5 and then add it to negative 5, that's going to give me 0. So let's write that out over here. Row 3 plus 5 times row 2. I'm going to go ahead and list out row 3. And we're going to add, and I'm multiplying 5 times row 2, times 0, times 1, times 2, times 1, times 0, times 0. All right, so from the top, 0 plus 0 is 0. Negative 5 plus 5 is 0. Negative 8 plus 10 would be 2. 0 plus 5 is 5. Negative 3 plus 0, negative 3, and 1 plus 0 is 1. So this is our new row 3, 0, 0, 2, 5, negative 3, 1. And our other two rows are still the same. All right, so now we're ready to move on to column number 3. In column 3, the first thing that we want to do is looking at that bottom cell there where we have a 2, we want to turn that into a 1. Now, we could add row 3 and row 1, and that final cell of 2, it would become a 1. The problem with that is that when we add 0 plus 1, that makes our first cell turn into a 1. And we don't want that. We need to preserve our 0 that's there. So a better choice for us here is going to be to multiply row 3 times 1/2 or times 0.5. So if I do 1/2 times 0, that's going to be 0. And 1/2 times 0 is 0. 1/2 times 2 is 1. And there's the one that we're looking for. 1/2 times 5, that would be 2.5. 1/2 times negative 3, negative 1.5, and 1/2 times 1.5. And the other two rows are still the same. So we've got our 1 there in the bottom column. We're almost there. We've just got 2 more cells that we need to turn into zeros there in column 3. All right, so here we are. Let's start with this negative 1 up in the top. We want to turn that into a 0. It looks like the best way to do that is going to be to add row 1 and row 3. So I'm going to do row 1 plus row 3 to get a new row 1. I think whenever we're adding or subtracting, it's a good idea to show our work out here to the side, make sure that we don't make mistakes, and also to make our mistakes easier to find if we do realize that we've made one, like I made previously. Negative 1.5 and 0.5. Okay, here we go. So 1 plus 0 is 1, 0 plus 0 is 0, and negative 1 plus 1 is 0. Excellent. There's that 0 that we're looking for. Negative 2 plus 2.5, that would be 0.5. 1 plus negative 1.5 is negative 0.5. And 0 plus 0.5 is 0.5. So our new row 1, 1, 0, 0. 0.5, negative 0.5, and 0.5. And our other two rows are still the same. Got one more step. We need to turn this 2 into a 0. And so I need to be changing row 2. The best way to do that is, remember, you always want to subtract or add a negative to turn that, get those zeros. So we're going to do R2, row 2, minus 2 times row 3. If I multiply row 3 times 2, and then subtract it from row 2, that's going to give me a 0 there in that, that middle cell. So row 2 minus 2 times row 3. Row 2, 0, 1, 2, 1, 0, 0. And then we're going to subtract. We're going to multiply by 2 all the way down. And row 3, here we go. Times 0, times 0, times 1, times 2.5, times negative 1.5, and times 0.5. Okay, so 0 minus 0 is 0. 1 minus 0 is 1. And 2 minus 2 is 0. There's that 0 that we wanted. Let's see, 2 times 2.5 is going to be 5, and 1 minus 5 would be negative 4. Getting a little crowded over here, but I think I can fit it in. 2 times negative 1.5 would be negative 3, and then 0 minus negative 3 is going to be positive 3, and then 2 times 0.5 would be 1, and 0 minus 1 is negative 1. Okay, so our new second row, 0, 1, 0, negative 4, positive 3, negative 1. And our other two rows are still the same, and so we have our identity matrix. This part is our identity matrix. And so what this means is that if we have matrix A equal to 0, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 3, 1, 1, then the identity matrix, or A inverse, is equal to 0.5, negative 0.5, 0.5, negative 4, 3, negative 1, and 2.5, negative 1.5, 0.5.